Welcome everyone. We are so glad to have you with us tonight. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm founder of the Parent Education Series, now in its 19th year, and nonprofit The Parent Venture in its 6th year. We are absolutely delighted and honored to have with us tonight Scott Doorley and Carissa Carter from Stanford's D.school. You're going to hear more about that as the evening goes on. Tonight, we're going to be talking about their wonderful new book, Assembling Tomorrow, a guide to designing a thriving future. So again, this is design thinking distilled in a very new and unique way. You're going to hear some interesting ideas tonight. We want everybody to have fun and think and open your minds to some new ideas.
Well, thank you, Charlene. We are thrilled to be here tonight. Scott's going to share a presentation, and as he gets that pulled up, I wanted to thank all of you for tuning in with us. It can be a crazy moment to be a parent. Scott and I are both parents in this area too, and we're here on this ride with you. It can be a wild ride just to be a human in the world right now. We live in this time when our climate is in dire straits. We're able to edit genetic code. We seem to be releasing algorithms that learn on their own, a new one every day. And it can feel like all of the intensity of the world is happening to us. But we are makers. We teach other people how to make things for a living. And even to us, even though this moment feels really intense, we know how much agency each of us has. And so we wrote this book, Assembling Tomorrow, to call attention to both the urgency of the unsettling time that we're living in, but also to paint an optimistic path forward that any one of us can take on. And so that brings us to what we're going to share with you today, which is really tools for seeing the unseeable. And the book, so there's our book, Assembling Tomorrow. You may have seen it already. And we're going to make our way through, share a couple sections and themes that pop up with you. There's a lot more in there that we won't cover, but also we'll share a couple activities with you as we go as well. The book really deals with, oh, go ahead, Scott, if you want to go ahead.
No, go for it. Go for it, please.
I was going to say the book has two main sections to it. The first section is really about the intangible forces that make today's moment feel quite off kilter. And then the back half of the book is really about actionable things that we all can do. Interspersed throughout are 20 fiction stories. They're all near future speculative fiction moments. And we'll talk about why we use that in a second, but know that there's something in here for anyone. And there's also a ton of fun illustrations. If that's your way into reading, we hope that you feel welcome from any one of those directions.
So as we dive in, we'll start with that first half of the book, which we call intangibles. And intangibles are the things that affect us greatly, but are a little bit hard to see. So this is a picture of 1985. This is the scientist Carl Sagan speaking to the US Congress about, at that point, what he and other scientists were calling the greenhouse effect, which we now know as climate change. This is December 10th, 1985. The interesting thing here is that his visit to Congress is, close to 2 centuries before the beginning of the industrial era. So he's talking about this initial hint that something that we've done is kind of having repercussions, but it's 200 years after the thing that we did began. This is 2021. This is Frances Haugen. Frances Haugen also speaking to Congress, and she's talking about her concerns with the impacts of social media on teens and society. She was working at Facebook at the time and had some concerns about how media was affecting youth and political polarization. Now, this is about a decade after the real uptake of social media that was aimed at, performing and statistics that push content out algorithmically versus sort of just fixed timelines with your friends. So the initial thing that caused the downstream impacts came out 10 years before she's talking about it. So you can see what's happening is things are emerging more quickly. Our technologies are really intertwined with our lives. And as they're intertwined with our lives, they have side effects that we may not predict. And it's not that, anyone creating them would have predicted, but we can see the effects coming more quickly. And so that's one of the things that's different about this era. And we'll get into some details about what that means for how we interact with the world.
We call this quickening, this moment, runaway design. And what do we mean by runaway design? Well, you can think of it sort of like a runaway train, right? You have a runaway train, it is screaming down the tracks, and it may jump the tracks, it might crash, right? You have to try to pump the brakes, but there may be a spill or some destruction that comes along with it. The thing with this current moment, though, is that that train is invisible. Those tracks are invisible. And actually, we might not know that the technologies like AI, like synthetic biology, or what we call artificial evolution, we don't know the effects that those technologies are having until they've already happened, until we see the effects of them. And that includes their crashes. It's much like a runaway train, but one that's really hard to see because it's moving really quickly and it's not in plain sight. It's happening within the code. It's happening within our cells and beyond. If we think, like, have we been here before? Well, yeah, there's been many moments in history that we can look back on and question and say, like, wow, that felt like a moment of profound technological change with ecological impacts, with impacts on society. 1950-ish, it's an age of nuclear weapons. At that moment, technology for sure felt bigger than us, like it defined humanity, um, uh, much like it does now. And we looked at this moment, right, and we pulled a quote from this exact same time that really drove us as we wrote this book. This quote is from Catherine Ann Porter in Mademoiselle magazine, 1950 again, "The future is now." It's part of the essay it was part of. "It may be that what we have is a world not on the verge of flying apart, but an uncreated one, still in shapeless fragments, waiting to be put together properly." And that really drove us. This desire to be really profoundly optimistic. We are people who are full of agency. We have all the pieces to make this future, and even though there is a lot that can and will and is going wrong, we can figure out how to put them together. So let's try to project ourselves not 70 years back, but 70 years like plus, into the future or to the year 2070. And we're asking ourselves that same question now. Like what will we be? What will we look back on ourselves and think? What is the future we want to create? But it's not just one future, it's many. We know we have multiple futures to create. We each have our own lenses on the world, and we have many to be building concurrently. And and then, like, what are we building? What do we even mean by design? I know that some of you may be familiar, but just to level set, when we say design in this presentation, we basically mean absolutely anything. Okay, if you look around where you're sitting right now, like, pick up 3 things. I got a book here, I got a phone here, I got a cup over there. Everything is designed. And it's all interconnected in many different layers. This phone is a physical product. It's got digital products on it. It creates experiences. There's systems that control how you get content on it and where you get service. There's technologies that power the functions on here, and there's data sets that were used to determine how those technologies function, right? All of those layers contribute to design work. And some people focus in one layer or another, but the reality is everything we make is highly interconnected and affects each of those other layers. There are near and long-term implications, some of which we can predict, and others that are really, really hard like hard to accept might happen, and because they are both positive and negative consequences of our work. One quick example of how that shows up for Scott and I at the D School is through our student projects. For example, this project Oleo Sustainable Palm Oil Solutions was done by two master's students, Gabriella Dweck and Kelly Redmond. And what they noticed was that palm oil, which is, these are some palm seeds there. Palm oil is one of those oils that's in every single product that you own. Guarantee you've used it today. If you've washed your hair today, brushed your teeth, eaten most foods, like you've touched palm oil today. It's also one that is really impactful on the landscape in which it is farmed, primarily in Indonesia. And there's many smallholder farmers that farm it. Basically, Gabby and Kelly were like, we want to do something with palm oil. We want to create a new palm oil solution, a synthetic palm oil that doesn't have all those impacts on the environment. And so they didn't just work on the technology, they working on the whole system, working with those farmers all the way to working with how does their synthetic option get distributed, that full stack from data all the way up to system.
We'll add in one more example just to give you a feel of the range. So another team about 5 years ago was working in India on post-operative care. So this is how do people take care of themselves after an operation? And this gets in a little bit to the idea of seeing the unseen that Chris and I were talking about at the beginning. So they worked with folks in India to look at what was going on. What are the facets of post-operative care? What's the whole journey of a patient? And one thing that they noticed right away were that in the waiting room, there were families just waiting, nervously, not able to interact with the patient. And what they did was they saw those families not as someone to take care of, but someone who could help with the care. And so they started doing a bunch of different prototypes to see how would it be to have families involved in the post-operative care process. So after a patient is dismissed from the hospital, how do they take care of themselves at home? And they started a company around this that's been now around for about 3 or 4 years. And these are some stats actually from about a year ago. So they've gone up since then. But down in the bottom left, you can see that this was a big one. So in cardiac care, they had a 71% reduction in complications. So significantly fewer complications. And they did this by noticing something that was there the whole time. It's not like the families haven't been waiting in the waiting room. Just no one noticed that they might be available to help. And then they made a connection there and sort of shifted the system a little bit. So it allowed this, kind of incredible reduction in postoperative care. And, now they have a company of about 70 people and they're moving to other countries to do similar things. So this is one of those things we mentioned early on, which is we called the intangibles. And the intangibles are these things that are just kind of hard for our minds to see, like the way things are intertwined, or how one thing leads to another, or the flow of things versus looking at the specific objects. So, traffic is kind of harder to interpret than just seeing an automobile. So one of those intangibles we call flow. And that's how things shift and change over time. So when you hear the word flow, you might think of something like this, right? Waterfall, water flows. We know it flows in different ways. As a river narrows, it might speed up as it goes from a higher elevation to a lower elevation. It can get more turbulent and also speeds up again, and then it can create some churn. So when you see a river, you can kind of see a flow in action. But there are a lot of flows that are affecting our lives that we don't really see quite as readily. And we're going to talk about one, which is the data flow. So this is, let me show this video real quick. We'll just get it started. You can see what happens. It's kind of a fun example, but it highlights all the details we're talking about. Oops, hold on. All right, so that is a Tesla going over a hilltop. So we'll just see that one more time. There you go. That's a Tesla going over a hilltop in Los Angeles. That street's called Baxter Street, actually. I used to live pretty near this street. And the street is one of the steepest in the continental US. So it's actually a 33% grade. Nowadays in LA, they won't build a street steeper than 15% grade. The steepest street in the continental US is in Pittsburgh. I believe it's called Canton Street, and that's a 37% grade. So this is really one of the top 10 steepest streets in the world. Now, because it's so steep, people have been using the street to perform stunts. So this is back in 1916. And it's, I think, the Ford Motor Company demonstrating how powerful their truck is. I think it was a 20 horsepower truck, and they're showing it go up Baxter Street. So it's always been a street that kind of invited stunts. But in the mid 2010s, traffic apps like Google Maps and Waze in particular was starting to give people different cut throughs through the city of LA. Now, if you've lived in LA, it's just backed up with traffic. So any way around the traffic, you're going to take advantage of. And so Baxter Street actually became this like famous cut through on the east side of LA, so you could avoid traffic on the main streets. But what that did was it clogged up the street. And the fact that the street was so steep wasn't readily available. It wasn't, easy to see for the people who were driving. And so they started getting caught on the street. So the street was getting backed up, and emergency vehicles were having a hard time getting through. And so what the LA Department of Public Transportation did was turn it into a one-way street so that people would stop cutting through there, and they would be able to get emergency vehicles through. But as I mentioned, people still use this street as a challenge. And right around 2017, social media started shifting toward video. So you get, things like Instagram Reels and TikTok and things where video is kind of like the initial platform to use. And so that became this perfect moment for this one-way street that became basically a ramp for these automobiles. And people would go up there and film cars jumping over the street. Now, ever since this happened in 2022, this Tesla flying through, that the neighbors have said, like, since then, basically every 2 weeks, somebody tries to do a similar stunt. So this is all an example of how the things we make start remaking the world a little bit, right? So no one really had the intention of turning Baxter Street into a stunt ramp, but as the data came to be, then people started doing the cut through. As the cut through came to be, LA Department of Transportation had to change the orientation of the street. Once they changed the orientation of the street, these video services came out, and here you have people jumping over the street. Now, there's a funny little example. Here's the Tesla again, just for fun. And there's a funny example. When the Tesla landed, it actually hit a parked Subaru. And so the owner of the Subaru was a musician, so he kind of got into the act and posted a song to YouTube.
Cars and those churches scattered near and far. And when the cops showed up, there wasn't nothing to do. They said, "Don't call us, boy, we'll call you." Now my Subaru's getting hauled away just when I was ready to go fishing.
So he apparently got a bunch of views on that video. So he was able to, even though he had the catastrophe of getting his car totaled, he was able to kind of capitalize on it through another data flow. So the basic thing we're talking about is, one, there are things that we don't really see, and two, these things are affecting our world pretty greatly. So what can we do about that? That's the question.
So we're going to try a couple activities all together as a group via the chat window here that really help us see, sense, and give shape to some of these unseeable forces. I had mentioned up front that the structure of the book is nonfiction with these fiction stories interspersed, and the top half of the book, what you're looking at here is if you looked at the pages on end, it's what that would look like, because we do have colored pages throughout the book. The top half of the book is why now is the way it is, the intangible forces. The back is how to use design to take action, the actionables. And then interspersed throughout are all those colored stories, histories of the future is what we call them. They all take place in the like 20 to 30 years from now. Some maybe even feel like they're happening already. And we really wrote these stories and put them in this book because when the world's happening around to us as designers, we like to try on other futures. We like to try on possibilities. We like to see how the things that we make are going to show up. And so by writing these near future stories, it allows us to craft moments and see if we like how we look in them. See if we like how these technologies have played out. A lot of the stories are about uh, interpersonal things that might happen or a spread that you might read in a magazine at the time. They are all rooted in some effect that we see happening now, and then we paint a picture of what might be. The two activities we'll try together are based on a couple of the stories within the book. Our first activity is as simple as answering some questions, okay? And for example, right now we have a story in here called Data Zero Top 10. Many of you know, I'm sure all of you know, that we are tracked in so many ways by all of our technological devices. Okay, so like, yeah, your purchase history, your location, if you're wearing any sort of smartwatch, like there's a lot of data that is collected about each one of us in many ways, shapes, and forms. And in this story, we propose this world where people have decided to go what we call data zero, meaning there are certain elements that you're able to remove all of your data from the world on. So you may choose to remove anything that you've ever purchased from the world data repositories. How we would do that, we don't know, but this story is all about what those things might be. So the first question that we have for all of you, and ask that you just put whatever ideas that you have in the chat window here. If you could stop being tracked in some particular way, aka go data zero, what would you pick to go data zero on? What would you pick to not have tracked about you?
And there can be all kinds of examples, it can be anything that comes to mind. We have identity popping in here.
Online purchases, location.
Location's a big one. Identity and location. Travel.
Conversations is interesting.
That is interesting.
It makes me wonder, like, what is recorded when and where. Yeah, so okay, so like who you've met with in different places, so that almost like layers of people's data there.
So tracked by nothing. I'm reading Andrea says all of it. I don't want to be tracked by anything unless I permit it. Right? I mean, that becomes a big question. Is like, who's it for and how's it being used?
It's interesting, right? Because by opting into a lot of services that we currently use, it gives them oftentimes more utility. And so it makes them more useful to us, right? So by allowing ourselves to be tracked, it makes it more useful to us. If you don't do it, that you lose that utility. So there's no middle ground. Like, how do you find that? It's a very interesting tension.
There's a fascinating one in here with eye movements, in a visual pro device and a headset. I mean, that's really interesting, right? Because it can kind of start to make assumptions about your intentions or start to really understand what catches your attention. And it feels like that could go one way or the other in terms of being helpful or harmful for you. Supermarket checkout cameras. Yeah, the number of cameras now, something.
Other ones that I've wondered about are like like my feelings or my emotions, like can they be gleaned from something that's being tracked about me? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I think it answers a question like when I see the minority report in there, when we're being tracked by things to some degree, they can make assumptions about us before maybe even we're aware of them. There was a famous instance where one of the big box stores kind of figured out that someone was pregnant and started advertising pregnancy related things, baby carriages and diapers and, getting ready to have a child to a woman before she knew she was pregnant. So the way she found out was by her shopping cart. And actually, I think her father found out. I think she was pretty young because he saw the shopping cart. And then it's interesting that like they would know that before you would. My thoughts from Andrea.
Target.
SC says maybe it was Target.
I think you're right. Yeah. You want to go on to the next one?
Sure. So as Chris was talking about, we have multiple stories in the book. Another story is about two siblings who are fighting over an AI personality that's an image of their mother. And so, as we were writing this book, a bunch of the things we were writing about came true between the time that we had written about them and the time that the book was published. And this was one of them. And we actually had to edit the book a little bit to get those references in there because things were changing so fast. But anyway, they resurrect their mom's personality as an audio AI, and then they're sort of fighting over the tuning of their mom's personality. And there are multiple services now that will do this. They create personalities. One's called Rememory, where they'll take photos and videos and letters and voice recordings and basically create a visual representation of a loved one. So that brings up a question that we had. And I think as a parent, this is the kind of thing I think about all the time, which is as these technologies are changing things so fundamentally, what are the things our kids are going to be dealing with that we can't even think about? So here's the question here. Since it's now possible to resurrect a loved one's personality via AI, do you think you could ever love or have a relationship with an AI? So you can say yes or no, or you can say not unless, please add to the chat and let us know what you think. And relationship could be like we said, it could be a resurrected loved one, or so we got one no in there. Yeah. And interesting too, if you have a feeling for why not. Holographic mom with smart movements against my better judgment. Yes. So like kind of a reluctant yes there, I think. Yeah. Yep. And their girlfriends in the movie Her, like there are many services that have sort of romantic involvement for sure. Sort of I hear like a make my AI cheer me on sometimes when I need it. So like a kind of friend or confidant. Not unless it provided a helping hand in the worst times. Yeah, I would love to listen to others now gone. Way to address loneliness, right? Yeah, so sometimes these things can initially feel sort of dystopian, like, no, I don't think I would ever want that, is sort of like your gut reaction, right? And then when we start thinking about it, you can get to scenarios where like, well, actually, maybe this could be useful or maybe this could be helpful. But of course, these are things, and there's so many of these. Chris and I aren't going to go into any more, but we have several of these scenarios. Bringing species back from extinction. Should we do that or not? And these questions aren't the future. They're happening right now. And, as parents, our kids are really going to have to deal with this world that, we're preparing our kids for a world that we're not prepared for because it really hasn't come to be yet. So we did a little chat amongst ourselves, and we have a second activity to dive in here too. Oh, we're still getting some stuff. How about saving our child at different ages? That's fascinating.
That is Interesting.
That's the first time I've seen that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, which is fascinating. Like what you've done in that response is say like, oh, how could this be something that we can't possibly do right now? Like, what could we do with it we can't possibly do right now that may feel really interesting and different? That is really, really fascinating.
Yeah, and I will say, like, as we dig deeper into this and these more nuanced things come up, we got a Taylor Swift reference.
It's
I
not a
love it.
presentation unless Taylor's part of it.
But as these things come up and as we can get into like a more nuanced discussion about them, we can start to see that like it's not just totally binary black and white. It's like there's some real nuanced conversations to have in here. And it both suggests, oh, maybe there are some things that we should be worrying about and we should be preparing for. And also maybe there are some ways to find opportunities in here. So we'll look at that next. Carissa, maybe you can digest that last content or comment while I'm popping into activity 2. So in activity 2, we're gonna start to give shape to the unseeable. So how do we actually prepare for these things that are to come, that are sort of things that we don't notice and things that are kind of hard to imagine? Any take on that last comment, Carissa?
I'll say my read of it is like, will we get to a point when an AI can sense and act and be in all of the different ways that a human is now? And I think what's interesting here, where Andrea is going, is like, maybe we're not going for replica, but we're going for something else that doesn't quite exist yet, right? Is there something different? Is there something that that we will grow to love that isn't part of what we can even consider at this current moment?
It's beautiful. You couldn't have given a better segue, Andrea, into what we're talking about, which is how do we find opportunities in here? And, let's say you're an entrepreneur or you're a parent or you're a teacher. It's as things change, they open up new spaces of opportunity. And how are we able to see those spaces emerge? So we're going to talk about one tactic, and then we'll do an activity that introduces another one. And the first tactic is changing frames of mind. So there's a lot of research, which I won't dig into right now, around how metaphors and the ways we frame things, the way we think really shapes what we're able to perceive. So we're going to talk about generative AI for a second and the metaphors that people are using to describe it. So I've been collecting these as I hear people talking, and we've been noting down when something comes up in a podcast, how are people talking about generative AI? Well, the first one that came up was a calculator for words. So generative AI, it's just a calculator for words. It's like, what we do with math, but it's for words. So if you use this metaphor, what's that highlighting and what's that hiding? So it's highlighting the idea that it's a tool. Like, this is kind of a resource. Yes, it might change the way we do things, but we're just going to get used to using it. And then we can use it as a tool for whatever we do. And it'll just allow us to go a little further. We do have kids learn the timetables, but how many of us at any given moment of the day need to sort of exercise math without a calculator, except for simple math, right? This is a tool we can integrate into our lives. There are going to be opportunities there. The second one that came out pretty quickly is on the opposite end of the spectrum, which was the nuclear energy, not just nuclear bombs, but it's nuclear energy. This is something that is going to be so powerful. The first use of it was a bomb. We're going to need to regulate this. We're going to have treaties around this. Like, this has to be cooperative. There's a very big doomsday scenario. So this metaphor then highlights, more of the danger than the utility, in the way that the calculator for words was more about the utility. And then we've been playing around with one, which is margarine. It's kind of like margarine. So if you think about margarine and processed foods, they're basically synthetic versions of the foods we eat. And margarine, if you use the metaphor with generative AI, it's sort of synthetic versions of the content that we create, or synthetic versions of the way we think. And so what does this bring up? Well, it's a substitute for something. Maybe there's some unhealthy side effects that we're not totally sure of yet. Maybe it's, maybe you prefer it to butter, but it's also like eventually not as good for your heart. So that's another metaphor. And when you change that frame of mind, it opens up new opportunity spaces too. So the thing that we suggest, though, is not that any one metaphor is better or any one metaphor is right. It's that you should be shifting metaphors back and forth. I think one of the things, look, let's say if you're a business leader or again, as a parent, like the thing we need to deal with is in the face of so much change. I think the real skill is not necessarily being right, but being able to respond to what's happening. And one of the keys to being able to respond to what's happening is to be able to shift your perspective so you can see what you're missing. Right. And it's interesting. Once you start to think in metaphors, you can listen to the conversation that you're having and start to see, like, well, what's the mental model of the other person? How am I missing that? What can I learn from that? What might I be able to explain to them by sharing my own mental model? So we shouldn't look at it as a threat or not. We should just dive in and see, what we can actually do with it. So let's do something similar to that.
Yeah. And as practice for that, we're going to do another activity here that we call Name Your Monsters. And if you take a look at the image that's here, you'll see that there's a monster from an old map on it. Now, you may have seen one of these old types of maps before, and I know that everybody's familiar with their children drawing monsters of some sort, but there seems to be like an age when we stop doing that as adults. And Scott and I really advocate for making this an intentional practice in our work. In these old maps, these monsters that you see here look sort of fantastical, right? You can look at that creature and know that it doesn't exist. But it's worth knowing that around the 1500s, when a lot of these types of maps were drawn, they were used not as navigation devices, but as encyclopedias of the time. So here's all of the knowledge we have about the landscape and the oceans, etc. It's all put on here on this picture. And so what that monster is in that time is a representation of something that is known and unknown. So there was likely a seafaring vessel that saw a fin go by, knew that there was something big in the water, but didn't know that maybe it was a whale or a shark or whatever creature it actually was. They didn't have a full ability to get a full picture of it. Don't know if it's dangerous or helpful or if it's there to harm or what purpose it might serve. So it's depicted as best as possible, but the reality is it's not entirely known. It's a map monster, right? And so what we would love to do now is to have all of us draw monsters that show up in our own lives or our own work. So what is unknown, unexplored, and possibly terrifying in your own work, and draw it as a monster? And we have a very specific way to try and do this together. We're combining the unknown, we're combining a glimpse of truth into a monster. And remember, like, we're doing this because monsters, like, they're just jumping off points for whoever's going to take up the work next. Those old ancient monsters were a way of keeping that knowledge, even though it was incomplete, in the public psyche, so that the next person, somebody saw one, we could build on it. We could know more and more each time. So we're going to ask you to think of something unknown, possibly a fear, and combine it with something that you sense to be actually true. A quick example, I did one, and Scott did one before this. For me, like, something that's unknown and maybe a fear is that, like, I worry about AI knowing my innermost thoughts and telling the world. Okay, we were talking about tracking before. I kind of hinted at this. Like, this is something I am worried about. Now, a glimpse of truth that I see is that there is a balance between like me sharing enough data with the internet to make it useful and losing all privacy that I have. This came up in our data zero conversation before. So what does that look like as a monster for me? Well, there might be a machine that might know me better than I know myself, and that scares me. What does that look like? Okay, I think it looks like this. I call it the thought revealer. It's got this little like it bores into my brain. That's what that screw is for. It has this little periscope that spies on me through my data. It's got cilia for broadcasting what it learns. It's got doors that open and reveal secrets that I don't know about myself, and hands for manipulating my beliefs. So that's my thought revealer monster. Scott has a monster that he calls the DNA data leaker. Like, we go around, all of us, touching things all day long, but we also live in this world where DNA can be taken from anywhere and we can sequence it and know who is there. And so his monster is this data leaker where one part is secured onto you and another part, like a leak forms somewhere else of your DNA. The DNA is open and out for anybody to see. There's no control over where it goes. So take a second now, and we really urge you to just try to draw something. You can like sketch it out on a piece of paper, like show your kids afterwards. What's something unknown that's a fear? What's a piece of truth you notice? And see if you can make a monster. Just give it a go we'll give you like 2 minutes or so. After you've gotten one, if you want to write like what you made a monster of in the chat, we'd love to see it.
No, we can go a little bit longer if we want to. Maybe 1 more minute.
Take 1 more minute. As you come up with something, just give us a headline as to what you drew. Oh, that's what Python is here. reptile foot squashing me with the weight of climate change, heat, floods, storms, no water, pushing down, squashing me flat, holding me in place. Oof. Yeah,
That's a
I
monster.
feel that. That is definitely a monster. Ooh, artificial super intelligence. That's what I was wondering what ASI stood for. Artificial super intelligence that controls us. Yeah. I see that almost like Bigfooty. I kind of wonder what that one looks like. Oh, an unknown death. Oh my goodness, these are deep.
Glimpse of truth as you go. That's a scary one too. Does anybody else have a couple they want to drop in there?
We had password Python before too.
Oh, right. That takes off with the passwords. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that all these have a vulnerability and a lack of control, right? Which I think, of course, that's what makes a monster, right? Like it wouldn't be a monster if we could control it or if we weren't vulnerable to it. But I think yeah, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was gonna add one on the Python there too, is that the shape of it, Scott was talking about the metaphors before, and how metaphors can help you formulate what's happening and give words to what's happening. Like when you say Python, like I feel that like there's something sneaky, right? Because that snake implies that there's like not a straight path taken when your password is stolen, right? So like and you get that by drawing it, right? Or by giving it that snake name. So by really giving it that monster shape, it moves beyond just like this amorphous thing to like this thing that we need to watch out for.
Yeah, and just building on that, so like talking about the metaphors, Carissa mentioned that we put these stories in the book to drawing your monsters. In some sense, there's a little bit of playfulness to all this stuff, or you might even call it silliness. But I think the main thing is very important to be able to knock things down to size so that we can deal with them, right? And getting specific about things helps out a lot too. So when you're in the unknown or when you're navigating ambiguity or when you're trying to figure out what's to come, sometimes being able to just calm yourself by getting into some details or playing with something a little bit in a different way, it helps put you in a more relaxed state. And a more relaxed state is one, you're more likely to see opportunities. There's some research about luck that talks about that we have in the book, about that relaxed attention opens up opportunities. And then two, you're able to kind of like start to get down to the root of the problem so you can see opportunities in the root of the problem. I think we're coming close to the end here, just time-wise, so maybe we'll close out. So we'll bring that quote back that we had at the beginning, right? We're definitely on the verge of something, right? I think we all can feel that there's something afoot, right? Whether it's climate change or the change in technology or our current politics, it all sort of feels like something different is happening, however you look at it. But I think what we could think about is, what are we on the verge of? It sometimes really feels like we're on the verge of flying apart, but maybe we're on the verge of bringing things together. And the one thing I would leave you with is sort of the idea that there's utility in hope, right? Like there's utility not necessarily in just being blindly optimistic, but in having optimism, because that's how you can see the potential that's out there. And so we're not saying things are honky dory. Things are very difficult right now. But what we hope is we can give you some semblance of hope and the ability to play with the things that you're afraid of, to see what opportunities might be hiding inside. So thanks so much for giving us the time. We really enjoyed being here, and we hope it was something useful for you all to take away.
Well, thank you so much, Scott and Carissa. That was a lot of fun to play with you guys, even if they were sometimes scary monsters, right? And thank you, everybody, for being willing to play with us. All right, we have a couple minutes. So if anybody online has some questions, please do drop them into the Q&A box. We've got a couple that have come in, and I think these questions will be relevant to our audience. So you ready, you guys? Here's
I'm
a
ready.
big one for you both, considering today's audience. How does your design work impact your parenting? That is, how have you guided your children to think about their environments and how they interact with those environments?
That's such a good question. Um, and it's so funny too because, well, like it's one of those things where like we do this all the time, and then I feel like I should be such a good parent because I feel like I'm talking about it all the time, and I'm like, oh my God, am I? Am I doing this right? So like know that like you said that, and I had all the angst. Like I have no quick answer for you. Um, but I will say that even if you don't consider yourself a like designer, you are designing as a parent. You design the schedule that your children have, how they get the 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 lunch that they're going to have that day or the dinner that they're going to have that day. You like design the activities that they have like at home when they're with friends and beyond. Like there are so many aspects of their lives that you have put intentionality to. Oh, thank you. I see one of my neighbors said that I'm a wonderful parent, so I will appreciate that and thank you, Pam. But like there are we have micro moments where we can model for our kids, hey, like here's what it looks like to look at this situation in a totally new and fresh way. Hey, like we could draw out that monster together. Hey, we could try an activity where we wander. There's one in the book where you follow a color and you wander around your neighborhood, right? Like there are things in here that we can do with our kids that are quite accessible to give them a taste of design work, and also like you are designing their lives.
Yeah, and just to add to that a little bit, that thing we talked about at the beginning, Carissa mentioned everything is designed. That's a really big lesson for a kid to learn. That moment of like, oh, the world isn't just presented to me. All these things that are presented to me were made by people. And guess what? Those people weren't more special than you are. You're able to create in the world, I think is one big lesson. And another way to do that is there's a woman named Hedy Lamarr who was a movie star in the 30s and was also an inventor. And she invented a self-guided torpedo that became the patent that became Wi-Fi, the switching in Wi-Fi to make Wi-Fi work. So she did that in the 50s, late 40s. And so I was very interested in how did she become this, incredible person who is, a movie star / inventor. And she talked about how her parents just pointed out everything around her. Whenever they saw anything, they would talk about how it worked. Like, oh, and that doesn't have to be machines and things. It could be like, something about how law works and talk to your kids about how law works. So I think two things. One, for them to see that things are created. And then two, for you to give a peek into how things are created. I think both of those are really useful.
Those are really great stories, both of you. And I'll tell you one thing is when you're parenting, it's hard to take a step back. Bev and I are both new grandparents, and it's much more fun to watch how your own kids are impacting their children. When my son takes his 2-year-old and gives her own grocery basket and she shops, and then he says to her, oh, look, you got this and this, you got Cheerios. Oh, that's good. You're going to get me an iced tea. It's so fun to see her impacting her environment. But I love that idea that we teach our kids about their environments because we are designing all the time, right? And making lunch has its own design element. Those are great. Those are great ideas. All right. So sort of in the same vein, since we're doing so well, what message do you hope parents can glean from assembling tomorrow that can become part of their family values or culture? I know these are not easy questions.
You go first this time.
Sure, I'll take this one. We end the book with a chapter that's called Aim for Imperfection. And that seems like a weird thing to do, right? In fact, we had one of the podcasts we were on, the host was saying, the back half, which are all the actionables, what you should do. And I'm going to say it. He's like, that all sounds like bad advice, basically. So like aim for imperfection, be awkward, shape shift, to disorient yourself. These are the chapter titles. And And the point he was saying, though, like he was an appreciator of the book, but the thing he was saying is like they're not obvious things to do. And this idea of aiming for imperfection, I think is really important. It basically says that we're not going to get everything right all the time. So if you can teach your kids that like things don't work out perfectly all the time, then they're much more comfortable when they're dealing with adversity, or they're much more comfortable talking about something they're worried about, or they're much more comfortable making a mistake. And we're not talking to kids or parents in that part of the book. We're talking to designers who are making things out in the world. And we want them also to be comfortable when something goes wrong. How are they going to figure it out? Not trying to distance themselves from failure, but to move toward it and figure out how you can remedy it. So I think aiming for imperfection can be super helpful for
And I think that
parents.
advice should start when they're babies, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'll build from something that comes from our shape-shifting chapter, which is really about like merging different disciplines and ideas together, which is that we often talk about, oh, be a multi-sport athlete, like don't specialize too soon. You hear that narrative around children a lot, but take that to your learning. Be a multi-subject learner. Like try on lots of different subjects, like take Mandarin, take Spanish, take math, not because you need to excel right away, but because each one activates a different part of your brain. So try on these different ways of learning. Learn from people that are younger than you, from people that are much older than you. Like try teaching. So like when you're a multi-subject and like multimodal learner, you'll stretch yourself and you'll find interesting opportunities. They often come from not staying like looking down the same path all the time, but from like really finding a new insight in our peripheral vision.
That's wonderful advice, Scott and Carissa. And look, this is technology in action. Don't you just love these floating hearts?
I do.
I do. Keep them
I
coming.
really do.
I love floating hearts.
I just really love them.
Mhm.
This was an amazing session today. And everybody that's online, I know some of you may know Scott and Carissa, but it's a wonderful book. And whether you start from the back or the beginning, I don't think you guys care, right? Doesn't really
No.
matter.
It's made, you can kind of enter wherever, whatever suits your fancy.
Right. And there's lots of stories, there's fiction. So there's something for everybody. But we really want to say thank you to Carissa Carter and Scott Doorley from Stanford d.school. Look at the hearts just keep coming. This is fantastic. Fantastic. We want to thank you for a wonderful session today. You've given us lots to think about, and somehow we feel energized and inspired. So that is a successful session. Thank you both so much.
Well, thank you, Charlene, for having us, and for everybody for tuning in. We're thrilled that we got to join you tonight.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Okay, take care, everybody. Hope to see you again soon. Good night. Take that, everybody, when it pops up. Bye-bye.